Hello people, welcome back to finally another episode of Warships CS. As always, it's good to have you back, and it's good to be back. So today's episode will showcase two relatively prolonged replay sessions featuring the Tier 10 American battleship, the USS Montana. Although this will not exactly be a detailed technical replay, or should I say review video for the ship, so we're not going to be staying in port and looking at the armor models and the stats and doing the number crunching, if you will. But much rather, the focus for the gameplay very much actually deals with the type of environment we currently have to navigate in-game, especially at this tier and under this sort of matchmaking condition, so to speak. So sure, you'll get to see what the Montana can do, how it roughly handles, and how I carry myself in this ship, which is always fun. But more than anything, this ship, it's more of a lens, more of an apparatus, in which you'll get to see the conditions, the ecology of the virtual environment we have to deal with, we have to work with in game, which to say the least, it's becoming problematic and less than healthy, so to speak. So let's talk about the Montana first. Since some of you guys probably have not had a tier 10 in game so far. Many of you probably already play mid-tier or low-tier in Warships, and I'm sure some of you probably don't even play Warships at all. After all, it's a bit of a sit-down game that takes time, and some people say it's for history buff and old guys, which I am unfortunately becoming at this point. Anyways, so the Montana in real life was a battleship that displayed more than 70,000 tons. It was a balanced battleship design, unlike the preceding Iowa class ships before this ship in history. So in other words, the mobility, firepower, and protection scheme characteristics of this ship are very much balanced. And in practice, it has a much thicker main armor belt than the Iowa Tier 9. And in terms of firepower, it does carry the same type of gun as the Iowa Tier 9, but it has an extra turret and 3 more guns. So these are the 16-inch 50 caliber, or should I say the 406 millimeter naval guns that in practice, in real life as well as in game, can fire the 2,700 pound super heavy capped armor piercing shells that are arguably in practice as good as the 18-inch shells you get on the Japanese Yamatos, without the weight and complexity issues associated with the super heavy weapons you see on the Japanese ships, so to speak. And you might think, because this ship has a much thicker armor scheme as well as superb firepower, its mobility might be mediocre. And to an extent, that's not true. The Montana, in a straight line, can actually make 30 knots, which is pretty decent for a battleship. Sure, many cruisers in the ship in the game can probably do 32, 33, even 34 knots. If they're French or Japanese or Russian, they might even get above 35 knots. And of course, some ships might be able to, use the speed boost consumable as well as, running the speed boost flag that can make them go effectively crazy, so to speak. So, how does the Montana compare to its peers? Superficially, the Montana might seem kind of unremarkable compared to its peers. Because, for example, the Yamato can bow tank even better because, its firepower setup of 9 guns with 6 in the front is more suited for bow tanking. Furthermore, the Yamato has the 18-inch guns that allows you to overmatch bow armor sections sometimes, which kind of negates people's attempt to angle. But then in comparison to the Yamato, the Montana has way superior AA scheme with plenty of 40mm Bofors mounts that the Japanese obviously lack on the Yamato. And obviously, you know, the Montana's faster. And, you know, in terms of potential alpha strikes, the Montana is also superior. Sure, the Yamato might have bigger shells and that does more damage each, but the Montana has 3 more guns, so that helps a lot. And in a way, the Montana is more of a generalist than specialist compared to the other ships, because the Yamato is a better camper, is a better sniper, and you know, you can sit on his ass and, you know, lay back, and you can do okay. But when you're flanking and pushing, the Yamato is a far inferior ship than the Montana because it's slower and its citadel it's much more exposed. That sits above the waterline, and also the front of the Yamato citadel is also a hexagon that sometimes allows penetrating hits through the cheeks of the hull. You know, some people might say if you compare between the Montana and the German Tier 10, the Großer Kurfürst, you know, they can say the Großer Kurfürst is an even bigger ship with more armor and more HP. But then the problem with the Großer Kurfürst is that its hull has significantly more secondary armor section coverage than the Montana. Because the Montana's armor scheme is what they call the all or nothing scheme. That means, you know, you either have a thick belt, a thick barbette, or a pretty good turret, or, you know, for sections of the ship that contains, you know, the bunks and the pantry and, you know, non-vital components like that, the ship already have thin plating. Because ultimately, you either want your armor to be thick enough to shatter and bounce enemy shells, or you want your armor to be thin enough that arguably, you know, the enemy armor-piercing shells would just simply overpan and not detonate inside your ship. Obviously, the German scheme with, you know, secondary armor sections of intermediate thickness can offer a degree of protection against HE impacts, as well as fire and also small caliber armor-piercing shells, such as, you know, those from cruisers and even destroyers. But at the same time, the German ships are much more vulnerable against normal penetrations by heavier caliber armor-piercing shells, because, you know, a proportionally larger portion of their ship can simply get hit by AP and causes them to detonate inside your ship and take relatively large chunks of your health away. Although, you know, if you want to talk about protection against citadel penetrations, I would say the Germans are arguably better because they have a turtleback armor layer beyond the main armor belt. So in order for, you know, most ships to hit their citadel, which is underwater, you have to go through the main armor belt and you have to go through the angled citadel roof, turtleback. And sometimes, you know, that's impossible. But in the same situation, the Montana might ironically eat them in the citadel, which is unfortunate, obviously. And perhaps I should devote some of my time to explain the gameplay scenario, which is which unfortunately has caused me a lot of grief and anger and frustration, so to speak. So, as many of you probably already know at this point, a disproportionate number of warships maps relies on, you know, capping more than engaging and annihilating the enemy. It's not like, you know, the traditional deathmatch format you see more in World of Tanks, in which, you know, each team has one cap, and you either take out everybody on the enemy team or take their cap, and you win. But much rather, on warships, there's this whole point system. Obviously, whoever takes possession of a cap collects point from the cap. And when you have 3 caps, you kind of become a game of wait and see. Who's going to have more than 1 cap? Because, a lot of times one team will end up with 2 caps, one team will end up with 1. And the team with less caps will kind of bleed dry. Slowly, of course. Of course, sometimes, a scenario like that will be counteracted by the fact that the team behind on points might be able to, kill more actual enemy ships and catch up that way. But sometimes, I would say the experience is less than balanced. The team that has won the actual fight might actually lose the battle. And the team that's actually has done the most damage might actually lose the battle. Because ultimately, with the cap game, sometimes it's all about stealth. It's all about vision. It's all about area denial. In which, sometimes destroyers that you can't even see might end up influencing the battle more than battleships and cruisers that have done heavy lifting, so to speak. And obviously, for those of you that have not played warships in a higher tier environment, I would have to say that, I think, the specializations and characteristics of different ship classes become especially specialized and exaggerated. Destroyers can potentially be extremely stealthy. Battleships become very clumsy. As in my case, even though this ship makes 30 knots, it doesn't turn so well, considering the size of the ship, which is almost 300 meters long. Obviously, this is something that you and I experience if you're used to tier 5s. So sometimes, you might be dealing with a strange and perverse rock, paper, and scissors situation in which, the battleships can fight a firefight amongst themselves, the cruisers can fight a firefight among themselves, the destroyers can even fight a firefight among themselves. But then, when you're counting ships of a different class, you really become a game of chance. Because destroyers can simply use their stealth and vision advantage to assassinate you from the dark, so to speak. Cruisers can really maximize their captain skills as well as their ship's equipment and specialization to make the most out of HEFR spam and to engage and disengage at will with good stealth and special consumables. Obviously, smoke will counter battleship well, hydro will counter destroyers, and radar the same. And a battleship, in a sense, will punish incompetent enemies like nobody's business. Destroyers might get close to a battleship, if they screw up their torp drop, your secondary and your sheer number of large guns will sometimes just rip them into pieces. But, as far as cruisers are concerned, if they're smart, they can put in a couple of strategic torp hits, start a few fires, and run away. Engage and disengage at the best of times. But then, if they become reckless, if they did not position themselves well, if they did not angle themselves well, if they didn't have an exit strategy, sometimes your big battleship would just make them pieces of floating Swiss cheese with huge holes and all that. I think, as many people have mentioned, the fire mechanics in this game is something that's rather difficult to balance. For folks who are used to playing mid-tier games, fire is obviously something that cruiser and destroyers can make use of to damage battleships. But battleship can recover fire damage. battleship can repair the fire damage. But when you're dealing with higher tier situations, sometimes higher tier battleships become, much more of a specialized fire sponge than their mid-tier counterparts, simply because how big they are. So when you shoot them with HE, they're hard to miss. But at the same time, higher tier cruisers and destroyers often also have very good alpha and DPS and good fire chance and many guns. So when you get confronted by something like a Des Moines, something like a Hindenburg, even the new tier 8 Cleveland, they can start fire much more than how your skills and consumables and strategic planning can counter. Because unfortunately your repair consumable doesn't get better at high tier. It doesn't work longer. It doesn't have a shorter cooldown. And the hero doesn't really get better unless you're dealing with specialized ships like the British heavier units, like the battleship, so to speak. So in other words, simply because you are not, fighting a fair fight on your own, you kind of become more reliant on your team to, do their part. Cruisers might provide a little more AA and a screen against destroyers. Destroyers might provide better vision and better scouting and capping. And both destroyers and cruisers can provide pretty good coverage of the flanks of a battleship's sailing course and flanks of its approach, which is a really crucial thing if you want to stay relatively safe against torpedoes, because as in mid tiers, with the torps in the water and coming, you can turn and maybe only take one, maybe not even take one at all. But high tiers, you're dealing with very stealthy destroyers or even cruisers firing torpedoes that are longer range, faster, and that hits harder. So the environment is less tolerant of mistakes, it's less tolerant of negligence, it's less tolerant of incompetence. And the game doesn't really offer any sort of compensation or consolation that affords you a higher degree of protection and survivability against such a phenomenon. But of course, the issue regarding teammates that are incompetent or that are oblivious isn't limited to just destroyers and cruisers, but also other battleships. Even though I'm mostly a battleship player myself, and there's a degree of solidarity between me and them, I can't help but to call out the, should I say, less than competent performance some people have in these ships. For example, in this battle, we essentially had a Grosser Kurfürst who very much hand back and refused to tank or engage enemies, which is very much against the meta for his ship. That has a lot of health, a lot of armor, and guns that have a relatively flat arc and high velocity, but are relatively derpy and inaccurate at range. Furthermore, his ship also has an amazing secondary suite that can hit at almost 11 kilometers if properly equipped. So essentially, he, with his own gameplay style and decisions, chose to not utilize the advantage he had in his ship to begin with. And arguably, those advantages his ship had were trade-offs. Because obviously, if you think about it, he has a lot of secondaries, but his ship is also huge, so he gets hit more. He has a lot of health, but his ship is big. But because of that, his ship is not stealthy. So there's really no point to hand back because he was spotted to begin with. I will say that arguably, probably the worst thing about Warships is the fact that you're stuck with these guys whether you like it or not for 20 minutes game. And most of these games do not develop into a rapidly advancing, or should I say developing, deathmatch, but much rather kind of become a slow meandering torture session in which you know how things will develop, how things will end up, but you couldn't do enough on your part to change the course of that. And you couldn't do enough to prevent your teammates from knowing any better, so to speak. But so is life. This is a very specialized game, and it's really not for everybody, but folks just like to derp around. But that's why we have GTA and we have Minecraft, so to speak. Shit, we even have Overwatch. That does it too. Yeah. But I digress. So here's today's second replay, not counting the intro and outro, of course. And once again, back in my USS Montana Tier 10 American Battleship. And this very replay was actually the game in which I did the most damage ever in my career thus far. Not so surprising, considering the Montana has many big guns and they're good guns. And I'm sure some people might argue that the Montana has statistically and dimensionally the smallest guns at Tier 10, as far as battleships are concerned. But you have to consider how these guns behave, how these guns perform, how these guns handle. For example, it has 4 turrets of 3 guns each, 2 in the front, 2 in the back. The bridge, as well as the upper structures of the Montana, is relatively compact for a ship so big. So the guns actually have a pretty good firing arc. So when you're running the Montana, you can usually safely engage the enemies without giving them a relatively flat broadside, which will be vulnerable to penetrating hits by enemy guns. That's something that we can't say about many of the lower tier battleships, such as the New York, or maybe the HMS Lion at Tier 9, because the upper board kind of blocks the arc of the gun. So in order to bring your gun to bear, you have to not angle your armor sufficiently and makes yourself vulnerable to the enemies. And some people might say that not just the Yamato that has the bigger guns, but also the French Republic, as well as the German Großer Kurfürst, also the British Conqueror, all have bigger guns. But the French already has eight of them, even though they're 430 millimeters, and the French has all those 8 guns in only 2 turrets, which means the French ships will be vulnerable to have his turret knocked out and has his entire firepower scheme impaired to a large extent. Well, the German guns very much relies on high muzzle velocity and lighter shells, which means not only it does less alpha strike damage, but also means those guns are relatively unreliable at long range. And the British Conqueror sure has bigger guns, and also 12 of them, and also in 3 much better 4 triple turrets. But the Conqueror, in a sense, arguably probably lacks the accuracy of the Montana, because the Montana, unlike most battleships, is able to equip a special upgrade in the upgrade slot number 6 that reduces dispersion value for the guns. That's something that no other battleships aside from the American Tier 9, Tier 8, and Tier 10 have. So as I say, at the end of the day, it's not really about how big they are, but how you use them. Yeah. in a sense, the Montana is not just, you know, more of a generalist than many of the other kill cap battleships, but you know, also more of a Swiss Army knife, and also more of a traditional battleship in the sense that, you know, you are not going in there guns blazing like a pre-dreadnought to, you know, mess the enemy up with their secondaries, because, you know, as fun as the secondaries, you know, doing damage to enemies sounds fun and looks cool, they often, you know, place you in danger, because you might become too close and, you know, ended up taking multiple fires and ended up eating multiple torpedoes. And also, you know, unlike the Yamato, this is not a boat tanker, because, you know, half your firepower is in the back of the ship. So, you know, sure, you can boat tank enemies, but you are really not making the most out of what your ship has to offer. So one way to look at it is, you know, your experience playing ships like, you know, maybe the Baron, maybe the Amagi, maybe the Bismarck, you know, any of the more traditional battleships with a balanced disposition of firepower can really, you know, help you a lot in this ship. So you don't simply sit there and, you know, reverse or make use of terrain cover, but much rather you want to angle and you want to move towards enemy and engage, and then you want to, you know, elbow and double back and zigzag and maybe disengage. You want to seek out that sweet spot range, should I say engagement range, between you and the enemy, in which your armor is reliable and the enemy can't really hurt you, you aren't taking too many fires, you are not close enough to get hit by torpedoes, but you're also close enough that, you know, you can consistently damage the enemies. And this is also when the excellent handling and accuracy on these 16-inch 50 caliber guns really come in handy, because they allow you to remain relevant and to remain dangerous to the enemies at a greater range and in a greater number of scenarios than the other battleships would. Because the reality is, you know, if you're engaging enemies at, let's say, 18 or 20 kilometers, broadside battleship, arguably many of the other battleships at that range will simply, you know, straddle the enemy but mostly miss. You know, they might get a shatter because the distance is too far, they lack penetration, or maybe they'll get a bounce, maybe they'll get an overpan through the conning tower or something like that. But with the Montana, it doesn't just straddle the enemy, but much rather it actually lands on the enemy. The RNG for these guns are excellent. So this ship is not one of those ships that will, you know, indicate that you have aimed well and you have, you know, shoot well, you have been shooting well, but much rather, it doesn't have the RNG to reward you for your hard work, so to speak. And obviously, as I said, the Montana really very much rewards a captain for knowing what he's doing, for you know, taking the enemy's distance and position and trajectory into consideration. Because unlike the Yamato, you can't just simply, you know, firing pot shots at enemies and utilizing good sigma, and the fact that your 18 shells can overmatch secondary platings on enemy ships to simply damage the enemies without strategically placing your shots. It's like the shotgun that doesn't really miss, and the shotgun that pans like crazy. But then the Montana is also not like the Conqueror, because the Conqueror can, especially when running the smaller guns in the Conqueror, the 419 millimeters rather than the 457 millimeters, can, as some people say, shoot HE shells almost all the time, and do sufficient damage to the enemies. Sure, in the Montana, I use HE shells against enemy destroyers, or usually in the beginning of the game when the enemy is really far away, so the chance of penetrating them or citadeling them is really quite low. And obviously against bow tanking enemies too. But much better, starting a fire might force the enemy to burn some health or to burn repair. It's the right way to start your battle. As in this battle, I, for the most part, so far, has maintained a proper engagement distance between myself and enemies. As you can see in the minimap, my team has taken over the two caps on the west side of the map and has very much pushed through, and a good chunk of the team is already on the other side of the map. But the enemies very much dominated the east side of the map, and their main force is well within the area in which my team initially spawned. So in this situation, obviously my other alternative would have been to, move closer to the enemies and to try to engage them in the brawl. But as you can see, there's too many of them. So if I have, moved into their positions, I would have been relatively vulnerable along and flanked by default. And even though my ship is bigger and stronger than many of these ships I'm engaging right now, I know well enough that due to their different positioning, some of them might be able to, get shots into my flank and seriously penetrating and damaging my ship. And furthermore, the combined DPS of all these ships is something that I simply cannot match. So by sailing away, I effectively, to an extent, negate their ability to lay in the hurt into my ship. Meanwhile, I'm still able to, engage them in return. And this is also when, as I said, the good turret angles really come in handy, because it allows you to sail away, but then you can still fire at enemies. Sometimes when you are sailing another ship, every time you fire, you might have to render the armor scheme of your ship vulnerable to damaging hits. Another thing to note is the fact that the relatively high base speed for my ship also come in handy at this point. 30 knot is just enough for you to get away from just about anybody. As I said, some of the cruisers may be faster and destroyers might not be faster yet, but 30 knots is enough to prevent the enemy from being on top of you on the spot. It protects you from being swarmed. It protects you from being smothered. Right now, I'm essentially engaging in a artillery duel against enemy Tier 10 German battleship, the Großer Kurfürst. And he seems to be taking significantly more damage than my ship, because his ship has more armor sections, which ironically aren't thick enough when he's not angled, when he's being hit by high caliber, or just a large caliber AP shells. Shells that would have overpanned and not have done much to my ship, all detonated within his ship, because his secondary armor scheme slowed the shells enough for the fuses to arm. And in a sense, the way the German battleships are, in that sense, is kind of historically accurate to an extent, because the Germans did tend to utilize smaller caliber naval artillery guns they kind of utilize a lighter projectile for their given caliber, as well as higher muzzle velocity and a flatter arc. Because I think the German doctrine came from their understanding that, because their geographical location, their naval battle will take place on the North Sea, that tends to have relatively poor weather and relatively poor visibility, in which tends to lead to shorter engagement range, in which faster shells and higher penetrating guns at relatively close range really matter. And for better or for worse, right now I'm essentially betting my ship on winning this engagement, which seems kind of reckless, as exhilarating as it was. Because my team at this point leads by one ship, and one of the two enemy ships is near death. Sure, the Grosser Kurfürst seems to have more health, but I felt that perhaps in a brawl, I might be able to get the best of him. Another thing to know about the Montana is that although it carries the same number of secondary guns as the Tier 8 North Carolina, as well as the premium Alabama and Massachusetts, as well as the Tier 9 Iowa and Missouri, these secondary guns on the Montana aren't the same exact weapons you see on the lower tier battleships. Because sure, they're all 5-incher 127mm guns. They're not the same model. These guns on the Montana are actually the 51 caliber version of those guns versus the 38 caliber version guns you see on the smaller ships. So in other words, these guns have higher muzzle velocity and arguably greater accuracy. And also in game, they have higher DPS and a quicker reload. And even though my ship is not really set up for secondary performance, my secondary did get buffed with AFT, which I have used not really for engagement against enemy battleships, but as a screen against enemy destroyers, as well as a degree of protection against airstrikes and carriers, so to speak. And you see, this is when and where I hope I can probably win the duel, because the enemy's broadside on, he's really close, he's a huge target, and his armor scheme at this distance and with this sort of angling is not going to be able to provide any sort of protection on unity with my guns. But I guess hindsight is 20/20, because the reality is that they started 2 fires on my ship, and I had already used repair on earlier fire, which I had to do because I was more or less out of heals. It's always a gamble. It's always about compromises. But by the look of things, despite my untimely demise, my team ended up with 3 caps versus the enemy's 1, even though both ships or much rather both teams were down to 2 ships at this point. But it looks like as the timer is about to run out, they are kind of out of points. And so it looks like the second to last ships on both teams simultaneously took each other out with shells in the air. And so in the end, both teams were down to 1 ship. But my team had the points. So that's that. So the first game ended up being a loss. However, I got 5 kills and a Kraken. Did a lot of damage, carried my weight. But unfortunately, no matter who you are and how good you are, and obviously I'm only a regular guy, there's only so much dead weight you can carry. The second game ended up being the highest damage game I have ever played in my career thus far on Warships. Without a doubt, I have done a number on the enemy heavy units. But more often than not, doing just that is not enough to help you achieve victory.